That's great. Again, a warm welcome, particularly to those who are connected online, who haven't heard what I just said, and to the interpreters, to the organizers, not only locally here at the University of the Basque Country, for giving us the opportunity also to visit Donostia and enjoy their great academic welcoming atmosphere, as well as to all the Fosterlang colleagues who have contributed. Yesterday, we had a very interesting, a very engaging first day of this very interesting workshop, and today we have the honor of starting day 2. And as Ivan said in his introduction, our focus is going to be on the evaluation of machine translation quality and post-editing, which is the improvement of the raw output produced by these systems. Yeah, okay, there it is. So very quickly, there's going to be a very short introduction, and then in accordance with the 2 main topics of the session, part 1 is going to be a gentle introduction to machine translation quality evaluation. You'll see on the slides quite a lot MT, that stands for machine translation, with a focus on minoritized languages in the spirit of the Fosterlang project. And particularly, I'm going to give you an overview of the comparison between automatic state-of-the-art evaluation metrics as opposed to human or manual methods of machine translation quality evaluation. Then part 2 is going to focus on post-editing MT output for minoritized languages, and we're going to try and focus on successful strategies as well as the challenges involved. And we're going to finish with sort of an overview of the ideal skill set of a good post-editor, so that each of you, whoever is interested in leveraging these technologies for the benefit of minoritized languages in Europe, that whether they be Basque, Catalan, Irish, or any of the others, can sort of get to grips with the topic. Throughout the session, there's going to be moments for questions, for comments, and we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to try and involve both the people in the room as well as those who are connecting online. And at the end, we're going to set aside some time to finish promptly by 11 a.m. As I was saying, this is joint work, not only within the Fosterlang project, coordinated by Professor Justyna Olko of the University of Warsaw, but also as part of this broader team. Here with myself is Dr. Catalina Amengual, for the first time here as a doctor, because she had her Viva, which she passed 2 weeks ago. So her first public appearance as a recent PhD graduate from Dublin City University, where we are based at the Adapt Center. And then our team leader and local PI is Dr. Iker Dotia, also in the room, and also part of the team is Dr. Maja Popovic, who couldn't be with us today, but we'll be referring to her work as well. So on this, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Amengual for a short overview that sets us going for the session. Here, there you go.
Okay, thank you, Federico. So yeah, before Federico starts with the workshop itself, I will give you a brief overview with the first really preliminary results of the responses we have for the Irish versions of the survey that now we are distributing and collecting. It's really important that you take in mind throughout all my presentation that they are really preliminary results, and we have 38 responses, so this is not representative at all, but at least we think that it's interesting to share with you this approach, this first approach, because it kind of justifies also the workshop that Federico will deliver in a minute. So I will first introduce some key demographics of these responses, and then I will touch some variables about language and translation technologies, and specifically about the quality and the rating of these technologies by the respondents. So first of all, the mean age of the participants that we have until now, it's around people around their 40s. And you see that in terms of gender, we have quite a balanced respondents, but it's not that case in education. The majority of our respondents up to now have postgraduate qualification, which it kind of relates with the high digital literacy skills that they report. So those are the three basic digital literacy skills that we wanted to measure. And as you can see, they have quite high means in each of these categories. And to finish with the social demographic variables, I also want you to check that also all the respondents, or the majority of them, report having very well skills in Irish, like for speaking, for understanding, for reading, and for writing. So this is also a very specific type of profile that we are going to comment now. So in general, so now I'm moving to the variables of language technology tools. In general, we see that almost half of the respondents are concentrated in agree and strongly agree regarding the quality of the language technologies in Irish. They think that language technologies work better in other languages than in Irish. But I also want to call your attention to the not applicable respondents, because we will see that not applicable or I'm not using language technologies in Irish in other responses too. So as I said, in a similar way as the previous variable, they rate generative AI tools in Irish bad or well, somehow like that, satisfactory, which was the second option they could select. But also, again, we have many respondents saying prefer not to say. And they, again, you can see that some of the reasons why those who use language technologies in Irish decide not to use them is for the lack of support, the poor performance or lack of support of the tools. After these variables, we ask them some specific rating of specific tools, such as online dictionaries, text-to-speech, and this type of tools. And I just want to call your attention to this specific one, online dictionaries, because it seems that there is a polarization, or many participants agree that it's extremely important to access quality online dictionaries. But with the others, with the other tools, it's the opinions are more diverse. So as you can see, with automated translation or with voice recognition, text-to-speech. But with generative AI tools, it's interesting to notice these 12 respondents, which is almost, a little bit less than half of our participants, say that it's not important or slightly important. So, well, as I said, please keep in mind that those are really not representative results. It's just the first approach, and these results are only for the versions of the survey to Ireland. But it's at least we can deduce from this first approach that language technology tools are not covering all the necessities for Irish users. And this is where Federico will try to propose something in that regard. But before Federico does that, I want to just keep in mind that, again, we are distributing the survey right now, and the survey is in different languages. It's in Basque, Spanish, French, then it's in German and Slovene, and then it's in English for Scotland and English for Ireland. It's in Gaelic, in Irish, and in Polish, covering the idea is that it covers as many language varieties as it can, and we will have more responses and more data to share with you in short. So now I just hand it to Federico.
Thank you very much, Catalina. So we have the sort of background set for this, and I'd immediately like to start involving you, very informally, and I rely on Itziar's assistance for the people who follow online as well to be involved in this. So I'd like to see with a show of hand or show of yes or no in the chat, if possible, if any of you have ever used machine translation, any kind, free online systems or through generative AI. Can I see the hands up, those who did? Okay, almost everybody in the room, almost everybody. Can I hear for what language pairs or what languages? Anybody? English, French. Okay, bidirectional Polish, English. Slovene, German. Anybody for Basque? Okay, interesting. So between two minoritized languages, things are getting exciting already, right? Okay, so Basque, Catalan, both directions? Okay, from Basque into Catalan, okay. Anyone else? Aranese, didn't work very well. Aranese and what other language? Catalan and Aranese. You can tell we're a community focused on minority languages. Right. Yes? Okay, so Mongolian, Thai, and apparently Mongolian worked very well. Yes? Okay.
So she says that on her job she has like many family languages that are not the same, like 80 up to 80 more or less, and that they have a system where they ask for their native language so that they can do their first contact like that. So a lot of languages are.
That's great. Very interesting. Thank you very much for that. And if there's any interesting details from the chat, feel free to share them again.
Arvin said Dutch English.
Dutch English as well. So quite a variety. I assume for many text types, and each of you will know whether it was song lyrics or business letters or an unlikely business proposal coming from somebody in a sort of different country from yours, with different names. And I'd like to hear on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is terrible and 5 is fantastic or perfect, what's your overall assessment of the quality of the MT systems you've used? I understand some of them must have been free online ones, some others perhaps proprietary, used within a company or kind of more professional licensed system. So anybody who thought that they were terrible would give a 1. Can we see with a show of hands? Nobody here. A 2, which means sort of insufficient to mediocre. Anybody? No? So we now move into the middle ground. 3, like middle of the road. Okay, 2 or 3 hands. 4, quite a lot of 4. So about sort of 60–70% of the room before. And 5, those who are, okay, there's one brave person who said 5 a couple. Okay, so overall, positive-ish assessment in this very informal way. What is the point of this session? To try and see how you can make your MT evaluation more formal, more reliable. For example, to justify an investment, or for example, to disseminate more widely documents which are written in a minoritized language and you want to translate them into a more dominant language, or the other way around very often, and see what challenges you come across. Okay, so let's keep that in mind and move on. Now, I have some examples here of translation between Basque and English, and many thanks to Itzia, who kindly sort of assisted me with this. These are examples of MT processing found in recent months when reviewing and checking translations produced for the Fosterland project. So it's a real life sort of small scale test, if you like. The sources were ChatGPT and the Basque neural translation system Itzutzaile Neuronala. Apologies for my Basque, but again, this goes to emphasize the importance of the work of the interpreters, because I had my first coaching session for Basque pronunciation yesterday afternoon, and there's only so far you can do within that short amount of time. You have the URL there for Itzutzaile Neuronala and the QR code as well. There'll be a few QR codes in these slides to sort of point you to the right online sources. And just to emphasize again, I think it has been mentioned, these slides and all related materials from today's workshop will be made available on the project website, on the Fosterland project website, for future use and future reference for anybody who's interested, particularly from the very wide range of minoritized language communities across Europe. So you're welcome to take pictures if you like, but otherwise by early next week, all these slides will be online. So just a few examples. Again, I rely on other people's expertise here. Quite often you get problems of pragmatic misinterpretations with MT, any kind, whether it's AI-based or kind of more traditional neural MT systems. So the Basque statement, Etxera noa, in English could correspond to I go to the house or I'm going home, on the basis that Basque does not have two separate different nouns for home and house as English would have. As we know in English, home sort of indicates the sort of emotional belonging as opposed to house, which is more the sort of physical building. And this is not readily available in Basque as a sort of lexical difference. So there could be some ambiguity there or an empty output that is not ideal. Example number two, mismatches in terms of verb aspect. So the Basque, gaur goizean, euria egin du. English, it's raining this morning. So with the progressive, with the sort of gerund form, if you like, and instead of it rained this morning, like earlier this morning, 2 hours ago, because the verb tense is not correct. Basque uses rich periphrastic verb forms, and English spectral distinctions do not always align with that. Ergativity. I understand there's sort of big differences between English and Basque with regard to ergativity. So the Basque sentence, nik su ikusi zaitut. English, you have seen me, instead of I have seen you. The system may misinterpret the ending in K for the ergative in the first word as a subject marker in English word order. So obviously that makes a big difference in terms of meaning, overall message that this sentence conveys. Negation structure. Now, negation is quite often a problem. Used to be a problem up until neural systems, which were state of the art until about 2 or 3 years ago. Now with AI, the situation is gradually improving, but as you understand, negation is crucial. Whether it's an instructions manual, a contract of any kind, you cannot skip, you cannot mistranslate, you cannot ignore negations, which are always very important. So Basque, es dut ulertzen. English, I don't understand it, where literally this in Basque is I don't understand. The it's as a sort of direct object is not spelled out. So sometimes this could be correct, of course, sometimes it could be too literal, and in context, in some cases, a phrase like I don't get it, to refer to a specific part of the conversation or a specific point, could be more appropriate. Something that we can say is that MT cannot always infer the correct pragmatic and situational register. So any connection or reference to the specific situational context may not be particularly successful in many cases. Other cases include, for instance, confusion due to the declension or case marking system of Basque. So English, where did you learn the language? Basque, non ikasi zenuen. And in that case, the follow-up response given by the Basque MT system was Amarena, which I understand is not correct. It should have been Amarengandik. Okay, so that makes a big difference in terms of the correct form of the follow-up response, if you like, to that. So I assume that these kind of instances give you a sort of reasonable reflection of what is also part of your own experience, whether you used Basque, English MT, or any other minoritized languages with any of these systems. More and more often, of course, machine translation takes the form of AI tools, particularly LLMs. So I'm not going to spell this out all the time, but whether you use ChatGPT, as from some of these examples, or Gemini or Claude or any of the other AI tools, whatever we say, and even when I use the phrase machine translation or MT, that also applies even more strongly for certain respects to AI-generated translations via LLMs or large language models. So against this background, let's dive into the issues of evaluating machine translation quality, okay? Because it's all very easy to give a sort of very impressionistic, kind of informal type of evaluation, as I asked you to do 10 minutes ago. What we're gonna try and do is explore the options that we have to provide more robust, more reliable, more solid evaluations of MT. There's no single correct way of doing this. I've been working in this area for about 15, 20 years, and things change very quickly. They evolve very rapidly. And depending on whether you are, for example, in an academic context or in a more market-oriented, professional, industrial context, some of the main decisions will change. And they're all perfectly legitimate. It's a matter of understanding, as Catalina was saying with regard to the survey, the variables involved and making the right choices for your specific evaluation scenario, which will be, by definition, different from time to time. And I'm not gonna include particularly formal quotations in this. It's gonna be very informal and hopefully clear even for those who don't have any experience in this. But let me start with a very brief quote by Yorick Wilkes, one of the leading figures in what was called even back then artificial intelligence, but well before it was fancy and on everybody's mouth. Especially with the application to machine translation and the processing of languages. This famous quote from a book that dates back to 1994, so more than 30 years ago, but I think still quite relevant today. Wilkes said, I quote, "Machine translation evaluation is, for all its faults, probably in better shape than MT itself." And this was a sort of sarcastic remark saying, at that time, machine translation, which is still largely rule-based, was still very primitive compared to today's quality, was not doing very well, but a lot of people were working on the evaluation of MT, okay? So it was a kind of inside negative remark about the community. Even though not much progress had been made, everybody was busy evaluating this progress, which had been very, very minor at that time in the previous decades of development of MT. But then this quote continues, and let me add the remaining few words. Wilkes continues and says, "And we should not change the referee when we happen not to like how part of the game is going." What this means is that Wilkes made us aware already in 1994 that depending on which evaluation method you use, you can be able to manipulate the results. And for example, put your own system in a much better light than it deserves, and or conversely, kind of discredit the quality and the performance of your competitor's system. And this applies both in the commercial world as well as in academia. Some of you may know that there are frequent yearly shared tasks where the leading research groups in Europe and beyond, including the States, Asia, all over the world, come together and they execute the training of their system on the same data set, and then they see which algorithms perform better. Okay, so there's a lot of sort of healthy competition within academia as well in sort of boosting the quality of systems, particularly for the benefit of minoritized languages, which are the ones where this work is more difficult due to data scarcity, for example, which is one of the topics that has come up a number of times yesterday and will be explored today as well, also with regard to speech In this talk, I'm not going to talk about speech-to-speech translation because that's sort of slightly more sophisticated. The colleagues from MPI, so Arvind after this talk and Paul in the afternoon, are going to talk about automatic speech recognition, so the role of speech, which is very important, particularly for minority languages. But for this talk, we focus on written translation, okay, just for the sake of clarity. We are in an academic environment. I take it that many of you, particularly in the room, hold degrees, and some of them are active researchers and academics. My experience of university life, both when I was a student in the late 90s, but also now as a researcher and an academic, is that at university you have to choose 2 of 3 things. So in principle, in theory, everybody wants to have good grades, have a great social life in your 20s when you're sort of in your late teens and early 20s. It's a fantastic life, very few responsibilities, a lot of fun, and sleep long, or 7, 8 hours as would be normal. Unfortunately, my experience tells me, and I don't know if people in the room and connected online share this, nobody can have these 3 things together. You have to compromise on at least one. So the point is that you can have very good grades, so graduate very quickly, be top of your class, have a great social life, but then you end up sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night, if that, okay, which is not sustainable, it's not good for your health. Otherwise, you can have good grades, sleep your 6, 7 hours a night, but you have to dump your boyfriend or girlfriend, stop talking to people, not have any friends, and probably damage your family relations as well. Now, I see people smiling in a way that kind of is a controlled acknowledgement that this is the reality, and it's not, things haven't changed very much in the last 30 years apparently. Now, the same happens with machine translation. So as of today, reasonable people, so unless somebody has an interest to sort of sell you something, a license or a fantastic system that solves all your problems, particularly for minoritized languages, so the likes of Basque, Irish, Catalan, Aragonese, etc., where there's not much training data available that is high quality, that has been properly curated. Ideally, you would want to have 3 things at the same time, which is high quality output for any text, from song lyrics to laws to essays in sociology, linguistics, whatever, with total automation. You just feed in the text to the computer, out comes a perfect target text in the target language. You cannot have this today, okay? So first piece of realism for today, particularly for minority languages, the reality as of 2026 is still that you have to compromise on at least one of these, okay? So you can have high quality output for any text, but then you give up total automation. A human has to be involved in the loop, for example, through post-editing. So that's what we're going to come back to in the second part of the talk. Or you preserve the requirement of high quality and total automation, but then you have to choose texts that are very specific and that match the training data on which the particular system or AI agent has been customized, has been tailored. So you can only have an empty system that translates well cooking recipes, but not newspaper articles, and not contracts, and not legal text, for example. Okay, so remember these 2 out of 3 rules that basically machine translation as of today, particularly for minority languages, is like university. I've never come across a fellow student or a colleague who can do all those 3 things at a very high level. One has always got to be compromised somehow, and the same goes for MT. So this is not a plug, because this book came out in 2018, 8 years ago. And it's a book that I co-edited with 3 colleagues of mine, Joss Morkens, Sheila Castillo, and Stephen Doherty. Back then, all 4 of us at the Adapt Centre at Dublin City University, and Joss and Sheila still there. Stephen now is at the University of Western Sydney in Australia. It's a book on translation quality assessment from principles to practice. Even though it's from a few years ago now, it still provides a very comprehensive, a very in-depth treatment of all the issues and the challenges of translation quality evaluation, particularly for MT, particularly for automatic systems. Obviously, this is pre-AI, but most of the things that are written in the book, which has about a dozen contributions from leading experts, will still be valid today in the AI era. So first binary decision that confronts you when you have to or want to evaluate any MT system, any MT product, is whether to use automatic metrics, state-of-the-art automatic metrics. There are some sort of ready-made metrics for you that I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail shortly, or whether you opt for manual human evaluation methods. That's the first kind of choice, the first decision you have to make. Each of them is valid, so it's not intrinsically wrong in either case, but each of them has got pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages, and I'd like to sort of explain them to you in a bit more detail. Let's start from automatic metrics. And you'll see I've used the sort of carpenter's or bricklayer's meter there. The sort of visual metaphor is relevant and it will become a bit more obvious shortly. I'm sure you've heard some of these metrics. Bleu is arguably the most popular, most widely used. NIST, Meteor, TER, TERP, because very often there is a sort of basic metric that then gets augmented or gets extended or gets updated. It's a bit difficult to keep track, but it's a difficult world. WER, which is World Error Rate. I'm not going to dwell on this, but Arvind in the next session is going to talk about this because this comes from speech technology, and Arvind will sort of illustrate this as well. CHRF, which is was proposed by our colleague Maya Pavlovic, who's on our team, so it's one of the favorite home products, as it were. What all these automatic metrics do is compare the similarity, the degree of overlap between the MT output and an existing reference human translation. That's all they do, all of them. Okay, so what's the paradox here? That to use any of these automatic state-of-the-art evaluation metrics, you already need to have a good quality human, preferably professional translation of that same input text into the target text you want. Okay, so the paradox here is that we need to have somebody who's proficient in both languages, a translator, to have already produced a target language version of a text for you to compare against that gold standard translation, the raw MT output. And if you think about it, this is a major paradox, because if you already have a human good quality translation, there's no point in applying MT to it, basically. Okay, so how can you solve this? You can have more than one human reference translation. So measure your output against 2, 3, 4 gold standard human translations. But this doesn't really resolve the problem. It makes it worse because it means you have to sort of duplicate or triplicate or quadruple the amount of work that goes into these human reference translations. Then you only need to have a quick and ready automatic translation. Next point, and I'm sure some of you have seen this already, so bear with me, but I'm not assuming any prior knowledge. These automatic metrics give you a score. The score is expressed either between 0 and 100, so 57, 62, 34, 98, or as a sort of in a bracket from 0 to 1, so 0.54, but it's essentially the same on two different sort of scales, if you like. The point is that these automatic metrics, by giving you a quantitative score, give you an impression of reliability, of objectivity, but you don't really know anything about what the system does well or well it makes even catastrophic mistakes. Because if you're told that according to metric, Bleu, NIST, Meteor, any of those or any of those family of automatic metrics returns a score of 54, maybe gets all the verbs wrong, maybe gets all the negations wrong into the target language, and probably that's not a sort of reliable MT system. Finally, as I mentioned briefly before, some of the leading metrics, for example, TER and WER, TER is translation error rate, and WER is word error rate, as the name suggests, are error-based metrics. So what this means is the lower the score, the better the quality of the system. because the score indicates the quantity, the number of mistakes, the quantity, the number of errors relative to the gold standard human translation that I mentioned before. So let me give you a sort of brief summary of this. We're still talking about state-of-the-art automatic metrics. Any machine translation conference that you go to, a paper to be accepted needs to have a component of evaluation this day. And this has been the case for at least 20, 25 years since the sort of data-driven approaches took over from the rule-based system. So let's start from the pros, the advantages of automatic metrics, which there are. They're very quick, they're very simple to use. There are prepared packages that you just run as long as you have your aligned source and output segments. The computation is done automatically. They're very cheap. They only involve, a few minutes of compute. They're replicable. So that means that if you update your system today, you can compare the output, the score of today's evaluation metric with the one you did a week ago or a month ago with your previous versions of the system. And hopefully that should show some improvement. But again, if your score goes up by 5%, you don't really understand what you're doing better compared to earlier. Okay, so it's all a kind of obscure art, if you like. But for this reason, automatic metrics are very helpful during development, in iterative sort of stages of development, including with AI, when you tweak the algorithms or what they call the hyperparameters. So I don't want to go into the technicalities because this is supposed to be a sort of overview session. But those of you who have some experience of programming and developing language and translation technologies will be familiar with everything that is involved in AI-based systems. However, there are many disadvantages as well to using automatic state-of-the-art metrics. They're ambiguous, they're arbitrary, they're questionable, they're obscure, and they're incompatible with each other. Incompatible in the sense that they're not complementary. Each of them focuses on a particular aspect. All these metrics are very well documented because they have a number of papers that describe what they measure and how, and the weights that they give to each various aspect that is involved in the evaluation. But even if you use a range, a battery of these automatic MT metrics, you don't necessarily get a comprehensive view. You just get a very fragmented mosaic style view that doesn't really inform you very much about what your system does well, what it does not so well or terribly. A typical example, I've sort of selected a very small kind of what a table looks like, keeping it to the bare minimum. So you have 3 columns, blur, meteor, and ter, so 3 of the leading state-of-the-art metrics. And in the rows, the top one is our MT system. So say that we or the University of the Basque Country for English Basque has developed a new system. And then there is a baseline system, which is very important, which is what you compare against to show that you're making progress on what is already the state of the art. And that the bottom row is the competing MT system. So some other university, some other company somewhere that has their own system for the same language pair. Okay. Remember here that TER, so the last column on the right, is an error metric. So the lower the score, the better the system. Okay. So if we try to interpret this, our MT system, the top row, has the highest blur and meteor scores and the lowest TER score. So judging by this, our system beats the baseline and is also very clearly better than the competing MT system. These may give us a very sort of clear message, but we have no idea what happens, for example, to the terminology, to the verb system, to aspectuality, ergativity, negations, all the sort of examples that I showed you about, and everything else that you can think of that is involved in a translation. So the message here is MT evaluation metrics of the automatic type, they're state of the art, they're very widely used, they're a sort of de facto requirement. They give you an illusion of being transparent, of being very clear by virtue of quantifying with a number, with a single number, the quality supposedly of your system and of any competing MT systems. Do they really tell you anything about where your system works and where it failed? No, they don't. And even if you can track improvements, so 5% improvement from one version of a system to another. You don't really know what you're doing better because maybe your output simply becomes more similar, closer to the reference human translation, but many new key, vital, critical errors have been introduced. You're never going to know about that. Okay. So what many people do, and what is becoming, again, sort of common practice, is to combine automatic metrics with manual human evaluation methods. Okay. And here, as you've seen, my visual metaphor is the tailor's meter. So something that is more flexible, that you can adjust, that can sort of fit the various kind of sizes and the various situations of MT systems. There are many, probably dozens, of different manual human MT evaluation methods. What I'm going to do now, in the interest of time, is focus on 4 of them. Okay, so this is my own selection. I don't suggest that these are the best ones or the only ones to use. Based on experience, based on 5 or 6 EU-funded projects that I've worked on in the past, and including for our current envisaged protocols for Fosterlang, these seem to be the more practical, okay, the ones that are kind of more convenient. We're going to go through them from the easiest method to the more complex one. And as you will see, the sort of order of magnitude of complexity and difficulty escalates quite quickly. So we're going to start with comparison or ranking, then move on to adequacy and fluency, and then move on to post-editing effort, which is also going to be a bridge to part 2 of the talk, and conclude on error analysis, which is the more sophisticated, the more complex of the manual MT evaluation methods that I'm going to show you today. There are many others: comprehension tests, direct evaluation, test or challenge suite, usability-based evaluations. We don't have time to cover them. So again, be aware that there's a huge range of possibilities there. We just have to start somewhere. But first, just as we did with the automatic metrics, let me give you a quick overview of pros and cons of manual human metrics. On the advantages side, they're very explicit. They sort of tell you what you want to know. They reveal strengths and weaknesses of your system much better and much more clearly than was the case with automatic metrics. They're highly adaptable. You can fine-tune them to your specific evaluation scenario based on the language pair, based on the text type, based on the use and destination of the text that you want to machine translate, and they can be very detailed. They can be very fine-grained. Whereas automatic metrics, they're very coarse. They kind of give you an overall number that is probably meaningless most of the time. However, unfortunately, again, even manual human MT evaluation methods have a number of disadvantages. It's not all a perfect world. They're highly subjective. We've seen that half an hour ago when I asked you, what was your impression of the MT systems you used? Each of you said, 2, a couple of people said 2 out of 5, a majority probably said around 3, a few said 4. But we don't really know what you paid attention to. Maybe some of you paid more attention to the style if they were translating poems. Some of you paid more attention to specialized terms. Some of you paid more attention to the acronyms if it was a specialized technical text. We don't know on what basis you formulated your judgment because it was a sort of overall assessment. They're very expensive. You need human beings spending hours and hours and probably days and weeks doing a very tedious, laborious job. Okay. They're very slow. So we're in a paradox here as well that, these days, even with AI-based tools, you can train, you can prepare an MT system in a matter of hours or really a few days of compute processing. But to evaluate the quality of that system, you might need 3 weeks worth of 2 human beings doing this very tedious job. So again, we're in a paradox that today developing MT systems can be quite efficient, can be quite quick, but their evaluation is a bottleneck, slows things down dramatically. And ideally, nobody wants that, whether it's in academia or in the market, in the commercial world, that's something that is undesirable. Human evaluations can be very difficult. Typically, for a proper in-depth evaluation, you need trained linguists. So people who really have a very solid understanding of both the source and the target language to a very high degree. Potentially somebody who would be capable of translating the text. So again, If you have access to somebody who can translate a text and need to reword them, is it really the best use of their time to ask them to evaluate an empty system? Because very often, the quality of empty systems, particularly for minoritized languages, which are our focus today, is so low, is so poor, is so unsatisfactory that it's not worth asking competent human beings to evaluate the output, because very often it's so poor and there are so many problems that first need to be fixed before it makes sense to move on to this. So I hope this gives a sort of clear contrast between automatic metrics and human manual evaluation methods. The first thing you need to do, and again, here I'm going to be very practical, as give you a sort of checklist of how you can perform empty evaluation. So first of all, you need to create the test set. The test set is the sentences, the segments on which you want to try out your empty system. For the evaluation to have any meaning, you need at least a few hundreds of sentences. If you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, so much the better. I don't think that's realistic for minoritized languages. Maybe if you're evaluating English, Spanish, French, German, yes. But I think for minoritized languages, a few hundreds would be good. 100 is probably a reasonable starting point for a small-scale evaluation. If you can go to 500 sentence pairs, 1,000 sentence pairs, you're already, I think, in a very fortunate position to have access to all that data, which includes a minoritized language. These need to be aligned sentence pairs. So for the applied linguists amongst you, they need to be parallel corpora, which means aligned sentence pairs that need to be representative of the text type and domain, for example, in terms of terminology, sentence length. Okay, so if you want to develop and evaluate an empty system for legal text, the test set has to consist of legal language, which reflects the kind of domain environment in which you want to apply your system. This test set is similar to, even for human evaluation, to what I described earlier as the reference gold standard translation. So the target side of this parallel corpus needs to be high quality and must not have been post-edited. You must not have used any of those parallel segments to train the system. Otherwise, there's a phenomenon that is technically called as overfitting. So essentially, you're evaluating your system on segments that have been used already, that the system has seen in development. And that is like giving a student an exam question that they've already seen. They just, mimic what they remember, what they memorized from wherever they saw. It's not a test of their competence or their knowledge. Ideally, but again, this is a sort of an added bonus, which, however, is very important. This material for the test set should not be confidential or private information, because in that way, you can use free online empty systems for baseline. This is a very sensitive area. Once you upload any text, any input onto any of the free online empty system, somebody else can have visibility of it, because unless you really read the fine print, and to my experience, nobody does, that goes into the server of another company, very often based outside of Europe. So, the sort of typical GDPR and other sort of guarantees that there are across the EU may not apply. And that material can be used for all sorts of other purposes, especially in these days of artificial intelligence. And it's usually always good to have a baseline system. So you compare against the state of the art to know that you're making progress, to know that you're improving. So within the sort of minoritized language communities, it is usually well known, or one can find out relatively quickly, what is the best state-of-the-art performance system that is available today, next month, or whenever you do this. So say you have a test set. Let's say, for the sake of argument, 500 sentence pairs, English Basque, or Irish French, or Mongolian Polish, whatever your language pairs were. You're already in a fortunate position, because not all the minoritized languages have that amount of data that is in domain with a high quality, human level, professional quality translation. Your next decision, if you go for automatic evaluation, because you need the results this afternoon, so it has to be very quick to have some basis to evaluate on, is which metric you use. Okay, typically you would employ a combination of them. So blur, NIST, meteor, you get as many scores for them, but it's very difficult to tell a story. So one message I'd like to give you here is that you get scores, typically 70 out of 100, or 64 out of 100, or 82 out of 100, which give you a very clear measurement, but it's not clear what they measure. Okay, so it's like saying, I have $1 million. Do you have $1 million, £1 million, £1 million yen, €1 million? And depending on what currency you use, your actual wealth is going to be very different. It's the same here. Okay, forgive the capitalistic analogy, but you know, I thought it kind of made, usually my students understand that when I say it to them. So these automatic metrics offer you measurements. Is it clear what they measure and how? And does that tell you anything about the actual strengths and weaknesses in specific terms of your system? Not at all. But you may have to live with that if that's all you can do due to limited time, limited resources, or limited human expertise. If you are in a privileged position, and you know, I wish that were the case for the minority languages that we care so deeply about, again, whether it's Basque, Irish, Aragonese, or Catalina, etc., then your options can be open to human manual evaluation methods. Whichever method you choose will have different cost, different duration, which is always in the range of days, if not weeks. Okay, you cannot get away with just a few hours. You don't get enough data. It's not informative enough, and different levels of difficulty. And the question here becomes, what are you actually evaluating? Because you know what you're measuring in this case. That's quite clear because you're the one in control. You're the one who decides. But it's not clear what you're actually evaluating as such. Okay. So, as many things in life, it's not an either-or. More and more often, people combine what they call multi-dimensional MT quality evaluation. So they start off always with automatic metrics because that can be done very quickly and it's virtually cost-free. And then you add some sort of even very small scale human manual evaluation to the extent that you can in terms of the time you have available, the financial resources you have available in case you have to reward and pay your evaluators, and the time you have available. You know, do you need to complete this evaluation by Monday, or do you have the whole month until the end of June? That will kind of guide your decisions. So these are the past projects that I had the good fortune of working on: ADAPA, ELRI, Principal, and currently Fosterlang. So this sort of shows you the background with which we come to Fosterlang, and is also a brief initial preliminary overview of the MT evaluation protocols that we would like to use with the end users and the various partners involved in the Fosterlang consortium, and more broadly to evaluate the updated and improved MT models that particularly our colleague Maja Popovic is working on back at DCU. Starting from English-Irish, we have a very interesting use case of school newsletters. You may know that in Ireland, there's a growing trend of schools teaching in Irish, through Irish, okay, which is becoming very popular and is sort of very interesting also for the revitalization and sort of social relevance of Irish in Ireland. And what we learned is that these schools try to have bilingual newsletters to communicate with the parents, with the guardians, with their external stakeholders. Some of these newsletters are weekly newsletters, and it's very difficult to find somebody who can actually translate them. So in collaboration with some schools in and around Dublin, as well as elsewhere in Ireland, we're gathering corpora, so bilingual aligned segments of English-Irish contents from these school newsletters, and that's going to be our first use case scenario. And we feel these are strong societal relevance to support these Irish medium schools in Ireland, which is very well aligned with the objectives and the sort of social mission of the Fosterlang project as well. So that's the first kind of test bed where we ourselves are going to apply these methods. So here we're in the metaphor of the tailor's meter, okay? No longer the carpenter, bricklayer's more kind of crude meter, okay? So let's start with comparison or ranking. Comparison or ranking. The name says it all, really. Here we are at the easy level of difficulty. So if you need an entry point into a relatively shallow but easily manageable human MT quality evaluation, probably this is your best bet. Okay? Because it's very intuitive and very quick. So what you do is you choose your input, you choose your source text, say in English, and you translate that into your minoritized language, whether it's Irish or Basque, for example. You need at least 2 different MT systems, at least 2. And what you ask your human evaluator is to decide 1 segment at a time for a given source segment, for a given original segment, whether they prefer machine translation A or B. Okay? So you have 2 systems, system A, system B, to translate into Irish or into Basque from English, for example. And what you show them is typically an Excel file, which has the source in English, and then has 2 targets, say in Irish, 1 from system A, 1 from system B. And you ask them, which one do you prefer? Okay? You have to do this ideally for hundreds of sentences. I've done this, it's a very tedious job. Okay, so whenever you go asking somebody, even if they're from the community, they have all the goodwill in the world. After you evaluate with comparative ranking 500 sentences, you don't remember any longer your name, okay, and what you're doing in life. So it's a kind of activity that needs to have breaks, and it's not very straightforward. It's really very demanding on the brain. Now, the basic scenario is that you have 2 alternative systems to compare against each other. So it's a head-to-head comparison, system A, system B. In fact, in most realistic scenarios, you can have more than 2 systems, say 3 or 4. But you understand that as the number of systems grows, therefore the number of optional outputs that you show the evaluator to assess, the complexity grows as well, and the process becomes slower. So in a scenario where you're evaluating comparatively, say 4 MT systems, within a half a day of work, 4 hours, you can probably only evaluate 300-400 sentence pairs. Is that enough to understand the relative quality of the systems? Probably yes, probably not. That will be for you to sort of decide, if you like. So the key point to bear in mind is that when you use the comparative or ranking human evaluation method, you're doing a relative evaluation. You're not doing an absolute evaluation. You're saying which one is preferable, which one is better, or probably which one is less worse than the other. But it could be that even the selected segment is quite poor and unusable. So that would become a different, to understand that, it would become an altogether different type of evaluation. One methodological key decision here is if you allow ties. So if you allow the respondent to say the 2 segments are either identical, which they sometimes can be if they're very short, or they're equally good or equally bad. Okay? The problem with this, and we've experienced this in our past projects, is that if you give people the opportunity to express ties, very often they do. They don't take a stand. They say, I'm not really sure, I'll go for a tie. If at the end of the whole evaluation, say you've given them 1,000 segments, and they come back 600 times out of 1,000 saying that they have no preference, you've wasted time, because people have just sat on the fence and they haven't given you an explicit preference overall. So it's for you to decide whether you want to allow ties or not. Second human method that we reviewed today, adequacy fluency. I guess many of you have heard of this, because this is a classic evaluation method, a bit old school these days. You know, when you get to review a paper and it does adequacy fluency, you say, yeah, come on. I mean, it's not 1995 anymore, right? So still valid in my own personal opinion. We've been doing this recently. It can give you some valuable information, but it starts to fade out of favor. So you've got to be aware of that. So essentially, what you do here, you evaluate adequacy, fluency, which are 2 converging but different concepts. Adequacy is the extent to which the target text matches, corresponds to the source in terms of contents, for example, contents, style, message. Okay, adequacy is a bilingual concept. Fluency is a monolingual concept that focuses on the target language only, exclusively. So fluency asks to what extent the output, the empty output, follows and respects the rules and the norms of the target language. Are the sentences well structured? Is the terminology correct? Is the punctuation in the right places? Is capitalization correct with respect to the target language rules? So what is important about fluency is that focus is only on the target, regardless of what the source might have been. And some people criticize this. I'm just offering it to you for reflection. But very often, adequacy, fluency are carried out together. So you get somebody to read an input segment, read the output segment in the target language provided by your empty system, and you ask them, rate on a Likert scale, which is 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 typically, how adequate this translation is, or how fluent this translation is. And they provide 2 data points for each segment, basically. Going up in the level of difficulty, and this is a bridge to the second part of the talk, which is coming up shortly, post-editing effort. So the amount of work, the amount of labor that is required to polish up, to correct, to improve the raw empty output, to bring it to usable standard, to bring it to a quality that can be publishable or sent to whoever the user of the translation is gonna be, okay? Here, we're at a high level of difficulty, okay? It's quite intuitive as long as you provide clear, well-defined guidelines to the people involved in evaluation, and it provides a wealth of qualitative data. For example, on errors and their correction. So one plus of this method, despite being quite laborious, is that it shows you immediately where your system goes wrong, which I said is impossible with the automatic metrics, okay? Because you get the raw output and all the changes that are required to fix those errors, to remove those problems, to bring the final quality as high as possible. However, this system itself, this method, sorry, also has its own disadvantages. It's highly subjective. So if you ask 10 people to do post-editing of one sentence, they will probably do it in 6 or 7 different ways, unless the errors are very straightforward. It's very time-consuming and expensive, and it needs to be managed. So there needs to be somebody supervising this process all the time. It becomes fairly complex very soon. One proxy for this is to measure time gains. So we're still in the sort of area of post-editing effort, human evaluation method. What you do basically, I can ask Sam to do manual translation of a text, and I can ask John to do post-editing of the raw empty output of that same text, and see how much time is saved, if any, by the person doing the post-editing, okay? So you have to time them, the amount it takes to do sort of pen and paper translation or technology-free translation, and how much time it takes somebody to do full, complete post-editing of the raw empty output. The theory here is that if time gains are made, that shows that the system quality is helpful, is at least reasonable, at least acceptable, maybe not perfect, maybe not ideal, but you're going in the right direction. So that's a sort of proxy, the time gains for productivity gains, which means that the system you're using for your minoritized language, in our case, does provide some useful support. If you really want to go extreme and you have a lot of resources and very well-equipped labs, as they have here, the lucky colleagues at the University of the Basque Country, you can do something like this. So eye tracking, which is the figure on the left, you get subjects, experimental subjects, to wear goggles, sort of special glasses, based on where the eyes fix on the screen and for how long, and the size of the pupil and how the sort of parts of your eye move. You can track all this, and you can build a model of the effort involved in post-editing, okay? If you really want to be very, very experimental, but you have to go through your own university's research ethics assessment committee, of course, you can go for the option on the left, So you get your experimental subjects to wear these funny hats or caps or helmets, which have all sorts of sensors that detect brain activity waves. Okay, so it's all kind of very cognitively based. Okay, again, this is kind of, it used to be very popular. I think again now it's kind of with AI is fading out of favor. But if you have a lot of resources and, you know, probably somebody in the psychology department helping you, this is probably the best you can do. But it's very time consuming. You need labs, you need equipment, and analyzing the wealth of data that you get from that takes forever because it's heavily qualitative in addition to quantitative. Okay, so again, you're already kind of in a very good position if you're able to do that. Fourth, last evaluation method from the human options is error analysis. This, in my experience, this is the most difficult, but also the most informative, the most helpful if you have the resources, the time, and the goodwill to do this, okay? It requires a lot of time and resources, and basically what you have to do up front is to design an error taxonomy. So a map of the errors that you want to catch and categorize in your raw MT output. You have to train the people. So say you have even 2 evaluators, okay, that you can have access to. You need them to understand your taxonomy very well. And that's not straightforward, even if they're linguists. I've done these things and, you know, it can take days and there are still always gray areas. So the process becomes very slow. So what you see here on the left, I know it's quite small, but it has about 15 types of errors. Some of them are very formal. Format, punctuation, capitalization, things like this. Some others are more linguistically significant, things like terminology, word forms, part of speech, sentence structure. They cover the grammar, the syntax, the morphology, pretty much everything. So the point here would be, as a person reviews the MT output, whenever they see an error, they have to tag the error, they have to identify, and it's not always clear whether it's a word, 2 words, 3 words, and whether the words are adjacent or whether you need to sort of go grab them around the sentence, depending on the morphology of the language. So I'd expect that, you know, doing this exercise for Basque is very different than doing it in Spanish as a target language or in French or in English. And it doesn't end there, because if you want to do this well, you also need to have bands of error severity. So an error can be obvious but minor, like, you know, missing capitalization, missing comma. It is an error, you know, if you need a top quality text, but probably the message is still conveyed. The clarity of the message is not compromised. You can have sort of average major errors, but also critical errors. Maybe, you know, skipped negation, or wrong verb tense, or wrong aspects, as we saw in the examples before. So essentially, if you ask somebody to apply this kind of error-based evaluation, first of all, you need to have a taxonomy. This one on the left is probably a basic version, okay? I've seen some which have hundreds of labels. So you can imagine going through MT output, which very often is far from perfect, having to identify every single error. And once you have identified the error, the job is not finished. You have to assign it to one of the 15, 50, 100, 150 categories of mistakes. So you realize why it's very, very time consuming. So if the quality of the output is average, probably properly analyzing and assessing a segment could take you 3 minutes, right? So if you want to have 100 segments, that's already a job that takes 4 hours, something like that. And you're still at 100 sentences. So it gives you a lot of information, but it's very, very slow, very time consuming. And you need to have trained the people, and you need to be 100% confident that the error taxonomy suits your use case. So the error taxonomy that I use for my target language, for my text type in my scenario, may not be suitable for what Ibon does in English Basque for his text types in his translation scenario. Maybe because I need for assimilation purposes, whereas he wants to use the MT output for dissemination, for external distribution. So all these variables will kind of play a role. And as you can see, it's all very complex. So I know this has been sort of a very quick overview, but I hope that at least, you know, it got you thinking about the right decisions and, you know, the sort of things you need to be aware of and avoid. One particularly authoritative text about evaluation of translation output, the official name is Translation Services, Evaluation of Translation Output, is ISO standard 5060 from 2024. So relatively recent. You have the QR code there in case any of you are interested. This is the abstract. This is the sort of overview. On the left, there is the sort of table of contents. It's very expensive. I think these ISO standards, to have access to them, you're in the range of hundreds of euros. In my experience, so I'm expressing a very personal opinion, if you buy the ISO standard, read it from beginning to end, is it going to become clear to you how to do MT quality evaluation? No, because so many variables are involved that, you know, probably you get a more elaborate, more extended version of the key messages I've been trying to give you in the last hour or so. Because it's a very complex activity and it needs to be tailored, it needs to be sort of applied specifically to the various language pairs, to the various text types, to the various communication scenarios that you want to use. So for full disclosure, I have to point you to this very authoritative source. Can you expect to have a sort of step-by-step how-to guide on how to perform proper MT quality evaluation? Not necessarily, because there are so many issues at stake and it's so complex that that's probably unrealistic. I think this would be a good point to ask if anybody has got any comments, any questions or specific on this, because then we have half an hour and I need to cover post-editing a little bit. But if anybody has got any comments, questions, or want to contribute their experience, I think this would be a good moment also for me to have a drink. Yes. I think we need the microphone for the interpreters who are doing a great job. I hear them in the background and their job is really very much appreciated. Thank you very much, guys.
Very much. Thank you for this fantastic lecture and workshop. I wanted to comment on your experiment with the negation in testing the machine translation from Basque into English. I just wanted to contribute to this slide and say that I carried out probably a similar experiment with Mongolian language, and I noticed also that negation always plays an important role, and like it creates errors. Also numbers, definitely, and also NERs, like named entity, NEs, so named entities. So also common names are also parts of the most tricky units that that don't get translated that way in artificial intelligence tools.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So even things that we would consider trivial, like acronyms, proper names, and numbers, very often get mixed up because, you know, the processing is so sophisticated. So basically, no aspect should be underplayed. One key element here to summarize this very useful contribution by Asha, so thanks very much. MT systems, including AI ones, operate very differently from humans. So the errors that you can expect to find in MT output are very different from those that even inexperienced translators make. So revising, and that offers us a great link to the final part of the session. Even sort of basic errors done by humans or common errors may not be frequent in MT, and conversely, the errors that MT does, including AI-based systems, would be very different from those that are made by humans, including the ones who are not doing a particularly good job. Any other comments or questions from anybody? Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating. When I was listening to you, I was actually thinking about all the poor students who have to attend their translation classes, especially at, you know, the humanities departments. And I was thinking that maybe using students for, you know, in projects like this one, where they have to evaluate machine translation, right? And maybe that could, well, save quite a lot of time and effort, and maybe more productive than actually making them translate manually when there are translation tools, right? Maybe
That's a very good point. We've done this, and it's always an option. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that we regard students as free labor, but there's also a learning element, because they're manipulating linguistic variables.
Exactly.
So, when they have to identify, categorize an error in a language that they're studying, or that is the result of a translation from a language that they're studying into their native language, they mobilize a number of skills, a number of sort of competencies that we think are very important.
Exactly. So what I meant is, usually those students who are studying translation or have to do some translations during their studies are quite highly qualified as linguists at the same time, right? Because they will have very, very high meta knowledge of the language, right? So.
No, absolutely, I agree, and I think that equips them with skills that are increasingly needed in the market, because we know translators are asked more and more often to do post-editing or QA checks of AI-generated text, including interlingual text. So absolutely, yeah, I agree 100%, which takes us to my sort of next point. How many judges do you need? So the point is that you could say, I'm just going to use one very diligent, reliable person. Yeah, I'll come back to the question, sure, just a minor comment on this. You might just say, I will go for one colleague, one senior student, one experienced linguist who will give me all the answer. It's still very subjective. So ideally, you have 2, 3, 4, we call them annotators or evaluators. And then to do things properly, more in an academic environment than in a commercial environment, you cross-check for inter-annotator agreement. So to what extent 2, 3, 4 people agree that that part is an error and what type of error it is, and how severe it is, because I may regard it as negligible, some other may regard it as serious or very impacting. So again, you see the subjective side of this comes up. So students would be good because you'd have people who are similarly trained, similar level, possibly very proficient, and with a similar kind of approach, and you can turn that into a learning opportunity and experience for that. So I absolutely agree with that. But so the point is, how many evaluators do you need and who are they? Which is always an open question. And 1 or 2 is not ideal for sure. Thanks very much.
Bai, mila esker, oso interesgarri iruditu zaite, aipatu duzun guztia, eta nik 4 jarri dut hasieran, baina orain entzundako guztia entzunda 2 ebaluatuko nukeen. Edozein kasutan iruditzen zait, gailu hauek balekoak izaten direla hizkuntza formala eta estandarizatua baliatzen dugu neurrian. Eta atzoko saioan ikusi genduen biziberritzerako hizkuntza estandar eta formala bai, baina ezinbestean informala ere behar dugula. Eta Euskal Herriaren kasuan, euskalkiak ezinbesteko ditugu. Beraz, sistema hauetan guztietan, aldagaiak eta euskaldunon kasuan, euskalkiak dagoeneko sekulako akatsak eta arazoak ematen ditu. Estandar eta formalean bai, akats, baina euskalkiekin erabat sistema erotu egiten da.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for the comment. I'm not sure whether the fact that your evaluation would go down to 2 is positive or negative, but I assume it reflects more awareness of how complex all this is. So thanks very much for that. Absolutely, I agree. So whenever we're talking about language variants, so non-standard or substandard, if that term is acceptable, as opposed to sort of standard official varieties, the problems increase because obviously there's not much data to expose the training of the systems to, or it's only highly concentrated in certain domains from relatively few speakers, and it doesn't reflect the rich cross-section of communicative situations, language uses that we would ideally like to see. So that's one of the top priority problems in my view, especially of minoritized languages, but to some extent, it also reflects to major languages. So I absolutely agree with you. Certainly, I think a fair statement to make is that since neural machine translation, so since the sort of 2015 or so, and even more so with AI-supported translation, significant progress in the quality have been made for standard general varieties of languages. But whenever informal spoken language is concerned and niche uses that can be by, dialectal variants, there's still a very long road to make. And that starts from the importance of curating and providing high quality data sets. My colleague, Joanna Duinska, this afternoon is going to talk about standardized or non-standardized language variants with alternative spellings and how to create language corpora for them. So obviously we have to see it as a sort of an organic landscape where all the things hang together, and our role, as I see it, as the sort of community of researchers, developers, EU-funded project members who are interested in minoritized languages, is to make sure that all these elements grow together, because it doesn't make sense to prioritize one area neglecting the others. So thanks very much for your comment. I very much agree. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. My question is only partly related to the exact content of your presentation, though, of the workshop, but it's a bit more. So my question is from a bit different angle. I'm interested in what really what do we know what happens with the data that are fed into the models, and what kind of control we have, how they are going to be used in the future, and how are the questions of data ownership and communities ownership, especially if these are data coming from minoritized communities or indigenous communities, if they so the question is basically with regard to data sovereignty. What's your take on this, and have this kind of concerns informed your decisions with regard to the how these data are managed and used in the Fosterland project?
Absolutely, that's vital. I think I mentioned earlier, I invited caution with feeding any confidential or proprietary or sensitive data into free online systems. And that depends on the ownership and control you have of the platforms for training, and also once you implement the systems in production. It's a very sensitive area. I think if you talk about the leading systems, you have virtually no control unless you acquire a license, and it's spelled out very, very clearly what the liabilities of the company are and what guarantees they give you for data protection that is not shared for others or reused in training. Because if you have any personal detail about yourself or other people or people from the community, you could find that propagating over to any other uses for that sort of language combination. So absolutely, that's a very sensitive area. These are very data greedy applications. So you need to leverage as much data as you can use. We always have our protocols of data encryption, data protection, and from storage and especially processing, we always use data privacy agreements with, for example, these schools that I mentioned that we give us bilingual data. They're happy to do it. We promise that we return a functioning MT system. We never promise ideal quality because that's unattainable at the moment. But we always sign official, through the university, agreements of data privacy and protection, and we give them the sort of details of how we store and how we process the data. So they have full check. With third-party applications, including AI platforms and large language models, if you use them, you do so at your own risk. So you've got to go and read the fine print, which, as far as I'm aware, not many people do. So that's why I discouraged people from using sensitive, private, confidential, or even kind of restricted data from being fed into any of these free online systems or large-scale LLM AI platforms, because then you have no control whatsoever on the data.
So thank you for this, and I just have a related question. Would you consider doing like a small session or workshop just focusing on this aspect for the project and for involved community experts?
If you think that's helpful,
I think this would respond to the concerns that the community members have, and also our own concerns, because sometimes we feel like we're like a bit of moving and walking in partly blind and not really knowing what are the limits and what are the security measures that can be taken. So the decisions, the protocols and the procedures that you already have established in your institution, and also the specific decisions that have been taken or guided you in the work related to Fosterland, I think sharing this would be really, really important.
Yeah, I think the keyword is caution, and obviously there's major legal implications. There's GDPR in Europe, but many of these platforms, as I said, are based outside of Europe. So even the guarantees that we take for granted, once you process some of the data, are not there anymore. So yeah, I agree, and certainly we can work on that, and we have good colleagues who are legal experts as well. So if you think that's helpful and anybody's interested, we can offer something like that. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. So I think we can bring this to a close and spend just the last 20 minutes on post-editing, but many of the things I've mentioned already will have prepared the ground for post-editing. Let me just finish on this. Increasingly, as I said at the beginning, machine translation is not only a system, or is not anymore a system or a piece of software that just does the translation. More and more often you have AI agents doing that, whether it's a large language model like the ones we mentioned, which involve all these critical aspects of data processing and data management. So this introduces a very interesting, but at the same time, very complex issue in the evaluation, because with these AI systems, you always start with a prompt. And the prompt, as you all know, can be very basic, as in translate this text from Basque into English or whatever. Or you can also provide what is in translation studies known as a translation brief, okay? So saying, imagine that this text has to be translated for an audience of engineers who work on the field and have to repair this machinery, and please translate this from English into Basque, paying particular attention to the specialized terminology. And what experience shows, although it's a fairly imperfect science as of now, is that as you change the prompt, so as you increase or diminish the type of information and the level of detail that you provide in the prompt to start off the translation, whatever your language pair and your text may be, the translation, the output changes. So this introduces a major variable in the picture, because then you cannot just evaluate the output, as in all the scenarios I've been discussing so far, whether it's automatic metrics or manual human methods, but you also have to factor in the prompt, because as the prompt varies, your output will vary more or less substantially. So when you are dealing with AI-based translation tools, particularly again for minoritized languages, that becomes another sort of variable, another moving element of your evaluation protocol. And so far, nobody has really provided a definitive answer to this, because one instinctive solution could be, well, we may as well use standardized multiple prompts. But then the question becomes, which are these prompts? Who decides on them and how many? Are we happy with 2? Should they be 5? Should they be 10? And you understand that the more comprehensive you want to be, the slower, more complex, more laborious the whole process is. So we're kind of back to square one. So for especially people in research and academia, this is very interesting. It's very fascinating because it's sort of an additional variable on top. I'm not clear that the sort of corporate world has really taken notice of it. They continue to sort of evaluate AI-based translation as if they were standalone empty systems, which we know they're not. So the prompts are increasingly a manipulating factor of the actual quality that you can report for your system, in addition to all the other sort of obscure areas that I've already mentioned. So my final message on this is that when we're talking about evaluating the quality of machine translation systems, particularly for the minoritized languages that we all and the Fosterland project cares so deeply about, it's very easy to measure. It's a bit more complex to evaluate. You can still do that with a bit of effort and goodwill, but it's very difficult to understand the actual quality. And I think what is really required, particularly for the minoritized languages, is to promote the understanding more than the measurement or the evaluation of the quality, which again has a number of complexities, which I hope at least I've been able to sort of illuminate to some extent. Very briefly, we've got 15 minutes, and I'm really appreciative for the comments. In the interest of time, I think we'll crack on so that at the end we also have space and time for some comments. Very briefly, post-editing. You won't be surprised to hear that we've already discussed a number of challenges, a number of complexities for empty quality evaluations. the complexity grows for post-editing. So there's no right or wrong way. There's no single, obviously correct way to perform post-editing, especially when minoritized languages are in the picture as either source or target languages, because everything we've said about evaluation still applies and is actually brought to a sort of very practical level where you have to sort of look at an output and decide what to do. Yeah, I'll skip this out. First of all, referring back to the increasing prevalence of AI-based translation, what we see, and this is a general statement, but I think it applies in my limited experience also to minoritized languages, AI-based translation tends to have less blatant errors. So the errors are very often not very obvious. They don't kind of scream at you. They don't jump out of the page or of the screen, depending on the way in which you're working. Very often, they're very subtle, hard to identify translation errors. Very often, there's a popular term that is used here, is hallucination. And I'm sure many of you have heard about it. So basically, the LLM produces output text, including a translation, that is very fluent. So in the terminology that we used earlier, has a very high score of fluency, but is not adequate. So basically, it diverges in terms of content, in terms of message, in terms of semantics, from the content of the source text. It looks credible. It doesn't have any wrong ergativity problems, any verb form problems, any problems with negations, passive forms, terminology that are obvious. They only become apparent once you closely connect it and sort of compare it against the source text. Okay, so that's sort of one consequence of the improved use or increased use of AI tools. So essentially, post-editing is a balancing act. Okay? And the three factors you have to reconcile, which is not easy at all. For example, in my teaching experience, the students hate this, going back to the point that you made, because students are trained to aim for perfection. And sometimes you've got to let go when you do post-edit. You don't necessarily have to change everything according to your stylistic preference. You have to make sure that the final target text works and is acceptable. And that acceptability level can require sort of making compromises on some finesse aspects of the text, okay? So basically, you have to optimize the relationship between quality, the final quality that you need, that you want to achieve, speed, how long it takes, and by definition, you need to be very fast, and the cost. What are the resources that you devote to post-editing? Because very often you need highly trained bilinguals, and it would be foolish to pay them to do post-editing when they would be perfectly capable of doing translation from scratch if all you're asking is to sort of fix and correct stupid mistakes made by the machine. So again, it should be the tools, the technologies serving the humans, serving the minoritized languages, not the other way around. We shouldn't become the sort of slaves of these machines. If their quality is not helpful, it doesn't really give us any benefit. So it's a sort of juggling exercise of achieving a balance, which is not given once and for all, but will depend again on your specific scenarios. Again, a very authoritative document here is the ISO standard 18587 from 2017. The name is Translation Services, Post-Editing of Machine Translation Output Requirements. This was published just about 9 years ago in April 2017 by Technical Committee 37. And what it does, I quote, is provides requirements for the process of full human post-editing of machine translation output and post-editors' competencies. It is intended to be used by translation service providers, their clients and post-editors, is only applicable to content processed by empty systems. Okay, so this, as I said before, is probably the most authoritative official document and guidelines. I know some of us have worked on post-editing guidelines in the past. Does it really tell you, does it really teach you how to do post-editing? No, because that will vary depending on the source target language, again, the text type, the scenario in which you're going to use your translation. So, first of all, There are different types of post-editing. These different post-editing approaches or strategies will depend on the type of MT system. So whether you're using a statistical, which is now sort of no longer state-of-the-art, or neural, hybrid, or AI-based MT system, as was pointed out by some of your comments, you will find different errors and therefore different things to change with different levels of intervention and effort. The degree of customization and domain adaptation of the MT system for the specialized terminology is also very relevant, and that's something that you can have some control on. And the language combination is very important, including, which is something that is often overlooked, the language direction. So translating from Basque into English will pose certain errors and present you with some challenges, which the opposite direction will either make irrelevant or change altogether. So within the language combination, the language direction is also very important. And again, we go back to many of the points we made about MT quality evaluation. So a very quick how-to guide, if you like. First binary decision, does it make sense to post-edit or not? That's your first decision, okay? So if you look at the raw output, even by sort of a quick scan, is it good enough to be post-edited? And that's a very subjective call. Then you've got to know what you have to change and how. And again, this sort of three-step process, so quick evaluation of the overall quality, understand and decide what you need to change and how needs to happen very quickly. If you're there pondering for 5 minutes whether it should be between or among, you're wasting your time, basically, okay? So you've got to be very quick and very efficient. Again, I'm not suggesting that post-editing is for everybody. Some people hate it, and rightly so. Some other people kind of enjoy the level of detail. You've got to be very analytical and sort of very precise with things. So again, it's a very sort of personal individual decision. Sorry, I'm skipping some of the slides, but I want to go to the conclusion within time. Remember this, okay? Especially with minoritized languages, as of today, you cannot have all three of them. So typically what you would do with post-editing is give up on total automation, because you accept that there will be a human being involved in the process, fixing, correcting, improving, removing the errors that you find in the output. Then you can be confident, because there's a human being in control, that you achieve high quality for any text, but you have given up on automation. So that's the price to pay. Finally, I want to give you a list of challenging phenomena for MT, and they become more relevant when you're translating out of and into a minoritized languages, because the systems will not have been exposed to a huge variety of training data, which are scarce by definition in minoritized languages. So some of them are more obvious than others. And again, the slides will be made available, so you'll be able to refer to them, but you're welcome to take pictures or memorize them if you like. So first of all, obvious, long, complex sentences. The typical case textbook example is legal language. Okay? In many languages, legal text, whether it's a law, a directive, or a contract, can run into 30, 40, 50 words. Necessarily, the processing of these segments become more complex, and therefore more problems can arise. Ambiguity for a computer, again, not for a human being. There are constructions in our languages that can be ambiguous for a computer, but they would never be ambiguous for a human being, because a human being has common sense, has real-world knowledge that these systems, no matter how sophisticated, they don't have. Lexical ambiguity, grammatical ambiguity, syntactic ambiguity. Any of them can create the conditions for an error, for a mistake. Different diverging structures between source and target language, and we've seen the examples with Basque English at the beginning, okay? So verb structure, syntax, sentence structure. German has a different syntax from English, for example, and that is likely to cause some problems. Unusual words, terms, phrases, and expressions, which probably goes back to the point of variance, okay? Even within official standard varieties, there are some dispreferred uses or some rare words or some unusual constructions. They're likely to be handled with some problems by state-of-the-art MT. Textual cohesion and coherence, phenomena like anaphora, cataphora, ellipsis, still quite difficult when the training data is not substantial, is not really very extensive. Figurative creative language, and how often there are metaphors or some sort of informal style or puns or play on words in the text that we process. Obviously, much of this can get mistranslated or simply be lost in MT processing. For similar reasons, polysemous or out of context isolated words or phrases. So typically this would apply to PowerPoint presentations. PowerPoint presentations use a sort of telegraphic summary style in the bullet points and headings, whereby hardly ever you have fully fledged proper sentences with a subject, a verb, a direct object, blah, 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 okay? And MT systems, state-of-the-art ones, are not trained for that sort of summary telegraphic style of language. So typically, I've done a number of tests with this, including with my students. PowerPoint presentations are not the best type of material to feed into an MT system. It can work well, but usually when you have isolated words, the ones that can be ambiguous, things can go wrong. Think of the word key in English. There's at least 10 ways in which you can translate that, at least into Italian, and I guess also into Spanish, depending on it's a keyboard of a piano, whether it's a key to open a door, whatever else. Okay. Rare context-dependent sentences and translations, and this already came up in our part 1 on evaluation, and even more so implicit hidden meanings. So, for example, allusions, irony, sarcasm, etc. So, obviously, we all know that these can present some challenges also for human competent translators, and even more so with state-of-the-art MT, particularly for minoritized languages. So I'm sorry that some of this had to be very quick in the end, but I knew I had more material than needed. But I think we are still on time for any comments or final questions that the audience may have. Let me thank you very much for listening, also on behalf of my co-presenter, Dr. Catalina Amengual, and many thanks to the interpreters. It's a real pleasure and honor to be interpreted into Basque. Thank you all very much.